Hello,
and
everyone.
it'll take them a little while to join. They'll be filing in, so I'll let you know when the room seems full.
All right. Hello, everyone. Welcome to International Relations and Journalism Department's event, Update on Africa. We are delighted to have you. I'm Burcu Ellis. I'm the chair of the International Relations Department at San Francisco State University. And my colleague, Jessie Garnier, is the chair of the Journalism Department at San Francisco State. We are here today very excited to be joined by four amazing journalists, global journalists who want to talk about Africa with us. And there's a lot going on the continent. This is a very timely discussion, so we are thrilled to be here. As you join in, please, we ask that you mute yourselves on here. This is a webinar format, which means that if you scroll over your Zoom controls, you're going to see a Q&A button. And in that button, you should be able to ask questions to the panelists, and we will also read them out loud as needed for everyone to hear. Professor Garnier and I will be keeping an eye on those. There's also a chat format, so if you have any questions and it's easier to put it in the chat, you may do so, but I think the Q&A can be seen by all the panelists, so that would be the best place to put your questions. We are very excited at San Francisco State University. We have a lot of students. Many of you have family that is from the continent. You're interested in the politics. If you're a journalism student, you want to report on the various aspects of the continent. So we are very, very thrilled to have you. This is very timely because just a day or two ago, at the United Nations, African leaders were up there making very strong statements about the fact that they do not want to be the victims perceived as the victims of the post-World War II order. They want to be seen as stakeholders. And they unanimously said, we no longer want to be sidelined in global discussions. We want to be partners. We need to be partnered with and not sidelined. Today in G20, African Union has a seat. Some of the fastest growing economies are actually in Africa. Some of the fastest growing populations are on the continent. 54 countries that are unique in a myriad of ways, that are beginning to become hubs of innovations and hubs of technology, climate change mitigation. We just, last week was the African Climate Summit, where African countries who do have the lowest emissions in the world are becoming a voice tackling climate change. So this conversation from an international relations perspective is very timely, and I am delighted to be here. And I would like to thank our professor, Juanita Darling, who put me in touch with Julienne Gage, who's an anthropologist and a journalist who has covered Latin American and African countries, and she kindly agreed to moderate this panel. We are being joined by Douglas Okwatch, who is the African Affairs editor of the China Global Television Network. He's also in the Foreign Press Association of Africa. We have Anne Soy, who's a BBC reporter based in Nairobi, and she has been covering news in Africa for a very long time, and her expertise includes public health. And we have Ruud Elmendorp, who's a multimedia reporter, reporting on the continents for a very long time, and his work has been published in the Telegraaf, Voice of America, Al Jazeera, and numerous other locations. We are especially grateful because all of our panelists, it is nighttime right now in Africa. So they are joining us at 8 o'clock in the evening. We really appreciate this time, and I turn it over to Julienne. Welcome.
Hey, thanks so much for hosting and for inviting us for this opportunity. As Burcu said, I have a background in journalism, anthropology, and global communications for global development, civil society, and civil rights organizations. So I am one of those people that kind of made that transition between journalism and these other kinds of diplomacy and development projects. And I was in Ethiopia last year, but now I'm based in Miami, which is more like the capital of Latin America and the Caribbean. But I wanted to second what Burcu was saying. You know, this is a really exciting time for Africa. They're getting a much bigger voice. We're really starting to see a renewed interest in the continent from all different kinds of angles. And even here in the Americas, I'm seeing a great interest in Afro diplomacy from Colombia, from Brazil, from Barbados. And so these kinds of connections, both from cultural and historical perspectives, but also with things like free trade, are becoming a bigger issue. So I'm really excited to kind of be able to help bridge these conversations and leverage the contacts that I had in East Africa to bring these panelists together. I'm super excited for what they have to say. And I know they've got deep experience and perspectives to share with you all. So I'd like to start with Anne, and we wanted to start with some of the highlights. There's a lot going on in Africa, and it's a huge continent. We'd like to know from you which countries you see as moving ahead in terms of economic growth, of advances in education, health, the arts, and other questions of social and environmental justice. And what would you say is spurring that growth?
Thank you so much, Julienne. Thanks for having me here, Burcu. It's wonderful to have this opportunity to speak to your wonderful students, and I've heard wonderful things about all of you joining this call. My name is Anne Soy, as you've heard, and I've been a journalist for close to 2 decades now, based mostly in Africa, in Nairobi, which is my city, but traveling across Africa, reporting on the continent. It is such a large continent. We're talking about 54 countries that are recognized by the United Nations, but the African Union recognizes a 55th country, and all these countries are very different, and they have all different issues. So it's really difficult to paint a broad brush. But I'll try my best to do what I really love doing about this continent, which is talking about what is working, what is positive about it. And when you talk about the economy, Julienne, this is a continent that is home to some of the world's fastest growing economies. I was just reading a report by the Africa Development Bank, which is like the equivalent of the World Bank for Africa. So they're estimating that in the next 2 years, we'll see an economic growth of about 4%, which is way above the rest of the world. And we have seen countries that are going through a lot of troubles, like Tanzania, rather like Ethiopia, but they have remained resilient. So I think what stands out for me is that resilience, that economic resilience of many of these countries, that despite the many challenges that they are facing, whether it's war, in the case of Ethiopia, whether it is challenges with health and other issues, their economies have remained resilient. And when you look at the impact of COVID, the war in Ukraine, and many other things, the economic growth has slowed down as it has across the world. But 53 of these 54 countries are still posting positive growth. So it says a lot about the resilience that they have. And when you talk about climate justice, this has been a big topic in the past 1 month or so, because there was a big conference on climate here ahead of the UN climate conference, the COP28, which will be happening in Dubai in November. And, many African leaders are talking about, the fact that Africa contributes least to climate change. It's less than 4% of carbon emissions, but then it's also very vulnerable. And so just looking at the contribution in terms of absorption of that excess carbon, countries are doing a lot. You look at a small country like Gabon, it's small, yes, but more than 90% of the country is covered by rainforest, and this is an important part of the ecosystem of, what is called the Earth's lungs. And they have played a very big role in preserving that forest, and it's important for everyone across the world to have that, because then the Earth is able to breathe. And they have tried to use this positively even for the economy. They're talking about green bonds or blue bonds, basically converting debt to, talking about carbon trading as well, so that they see this as a contributing factor, a contribution to dealing with the effects of climate change, but then they also get some money out of it. And when you look at, the whole world is talking about going green, and a country like mine, Kenya, 93% of its energy comes from renewable sources. And for many countries, this is just a dream. It is on paper that they have big targets of going green in the next so many years, but Kenya is very nearly there. So when you look at some of the positives, this is a country that really stands out in that, and they hope that by the year 2030, they'll have transitioned 100% to green energy. When you talk about green energy, it's hydropower, it's geothermal power sources, it's solar and wind, generating a lot of the power that we consume here. And the one thing that really stands out about Africa is just the enormous amount of natural resources that many countries are endowed with. And what I like looking at is the Democratic Republic of Congo, right in the center of the continent. This is a large country, the size of Western Europe. And Western Europe, you're talking about, quite a number of countries. And it has gold, it has diamonds, and two important minerals that we need at this time in our world, that is cobalt and copper. Minerals that are used in the manufacture of batteries when you talk about electric vehicles, and also mobile phones. I mean, I believe each one of you has a mobile phone. Part of that component, a key part of that mobile phone, might have actually come from the Democratic Republic of Congo, from what is mined there. My colleague Douglas will talk about what isn't working, and so I will just focus on what is there, because despite all this wealth, it doesn't really benefit the people. It is home, the Democratic Republic of Congo is home to some of the world's poorest people. But I'll leave that to Douglas to talk about. And when you talk about the population, yes, 1 minute, I'll rush through the rest. So Julienne did talk about some of the leaders who are, the increasing interest in Africa, and why are global leaders much more interested in Africa. We have seen the First Lady Jill Biden visit here. We've seen the Vice President as well has visited Africa, and many other global leaders. Why? One of the things that really is attractive about Africa is the population. It is home to the world's youngest population. Average age, the median age is 19. And so countries are seeing a big market for their produce and a huge pool to get labor from. And by 2050, it's estimated a quarter of the world's population will be living here. That's what makes Africa very attractive. And there's a lot that it contributes in terms of culture, arts, sports, wildlife, and in terms of politics. There are examples of growing democracies on the continent. Thank you so much.
Thank you. That's wonderful. Would Douglas and Ruud like to weigh in on any other highlights that you see or things that you want to mention before we get into kind of the more the concerning conflicts in the region?
Yes, certainly. Thank you, Anne, for your wonderful introduction, to which I'm not having so much to add. But what I want to add is the energy of the young people in Africa, because I came here in the year 2002, when mobile phones were just starting and people were sending SMSs. And in the last 20 years, I've seen it growing a lot. Everybody's developing apps. They absorb new technologies. And you can see across the continent where I went, in South Africa, Egypt, or Nigeria, you'll find large groups of young people sitting in internet cafes, developing apps which contribute to the needs of the people, like health apps, food apps, transport apps. You cannot even imagine how much there are. When once you enter the country, they have their own Ubers, they have their own Bolts, and it's all working. And it goes at an amazingly fast pace, and so fast that old technologies are still there, while the new technologies come in. And that's a very nice crossover, which we can see. So that's what I want to add, to the energy of the young people and their will to change, to remove the corrupt generations.
That's perfect. That's wonderful. And I wanted to just insert really quickly that when I was in Rwanda last year, I was just completely blown away by what you're describing, this massive techie culture and scene. And there was a huge film and arts scene that was helping to change this narrative that our generation 30 years ago remembered about kind of the dark times and the genocide. And so it's really exciting to see not only all of this advances in technology amongst these young people, but how they're changing the story of their countries. So, but that being said, we're still dealing with some pretty concerning conflicts, especially across the Sahel region, which, as you probably know, is the region that's kind of just below the Sahara Desert, kind of goes east-west or west-east. So I'm hoping that Douglas, who has kindly given us a PowerPoint presentation, can tell us a little bit more about what are those contributing factors, how they're related to historical issues of colonialism and also climate change. So we'll let him take it from here.
Thanks, Julienne, for the hard work of putting this meeting together. And also thanks to Burcu. And it's a pleasure to share this platform with Anne, who was a former colleague and still is a professional colleague, and also Ruud. First of all, before I go to the situation in the Sahel, I'd like to probably say 2 or 3 things, basically respond to the issues that Anne was raising in a very quick way. First of all, we talk about resources. Anne spoke about resources and talked about how Africa is endowed with resources, and gave examples of countries that can be singled out as really rich in resources. And Democratic Republic of Congo is one of those countries. But we also all know what's going on in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. Actually, Democratic Republic of the Congo is home to the longest peace mission in the world, the longest UN peace mission in the world, because of the conflict there. It has resources, but it is also fraught with conflict. So then, therefore, we have many countries that have converged in the Democratic Republic of Congo to exploit its resources. So some of these foreign countries, and some of these are also neighboring countries. So Democratic Republic of the Congo is a theater of war between Uganda, Rwanda. Sometimes it draws in countries from as far south. And at the moment, as we speak, the East African community even has a standby force in the DRC. So yes, it has resources, but those resources are the cause of the conflict that we see in the DR Congo. Now, Gabon also, if you're talking about the historical, particularly the French, it has oil. It is oil rich. Gabon is oil rich. So is Nigeria. So is Angola. So there are a number of African countries that produce oil, but these countries export crude. And by exporting crude, they export a whole line of processing. So they export, in essence, they export the jobs. When you export crude, it means you have not set up refineries. You can't process the oil. Then therefore you export an entire chain of production processes. And as a consequence of that, you also export jobs, the much needed jobs in Africa. So that is the unfortunate situation about the oil in Africa. You can say that about Gabon. You can say that about Nigeria. You can say that about Angola. You can say that about many African countries that are oil rich, that they do not process the product. So in turn, what we see is that they export raw materials, raw oil, crude oil, and then import finished products at a cost. Then also the issue of food security. They say Africa is home to 60% of the world's arable land. But at the same time, Africa is also food insecure. And that was exposed by the conflict in Ukraine. The Ukraine war, the Russia-Ukraine conflict, exposed just how dependent Africa is on food imported from Russia, from Ukraine. So the question then you ask is, why can't Africa, with the largest, with the world's, the largest proportion of the world's arable land, be food secure? So it means there is a missing link there. And also, I'd also like to respond to climate, which is really a big issue. We know that at COP27, Africa took a common position, and that was just transition. Africa was saying at COP27 in Sharm el-Sheikh in Cairo, in Egypt, that we need just transition. Just transition means, please let us use the fossil fuels as we slowly transit to cleaner energy. That this fossil fuel needs to drive our industry, that needs to drive our growth, needs to create employment for us. So we cannot just quickly phase out fossil fuels. So allow us to use fossil fuels as we slowly transition to clean energy. Now, the Africa Climate Summit just ended in Nairobi. And unfortunately, there is no clear common position that Africa is taking to Dubai at COP28. The question then, therefore, is who was setting the agenda at the Africa Climate Summit in Nairobi? It certainly wasn't Africa. And because we have a raft of decisions which Africa claims to be the common position, it means that Africa between now and COP28 in Dubai will still have to come up with a common position. Now going to the Sahel, which I want to talk about very quickly, and this is more about the French legacy, the French colonial legacy in Africa. And that French colonial legacy in Africa has to do with former French colonies, some of which have rebelled against France. So we are talking about Burkina Faso, we are talking about Mali, we are now talking about Niger, and even the problem in Gabon has to some extent linked to that French colonial legacy. You could say that the French adopted a different kind of relationship with its colonies from that of the British, for example. The British used indirect rule. The French used what we call assimilation, which meant that citizens of French colonies in Africa were somehow citizens of France, in a manner of speaking. They call it l'Afrique. So then, therefore, France has a lot of problems in Africa. The problem in Niger is a consequence of anti-French sentiment, which started in Mali, led to the kicking out of the French there, which spread to Burkina Faso, and now is in Niger. Now Niger, Burkina Faso, and Mali have now come up with what they are calling a joint security pact, which means that Niger, Burkina Faso, and Mali are seeing themselves as cutting themselves off from ECOWAS, which is the regional bloc, and that is problematic. Now, initially, ECOWAS was meant to intervene in Niger because ECOWAS has a military wing called ECOMOG, which it has used to intervene in other countries. Then, therefore, even the planned intervention in Niger to restore the civilian rule wasn't going to be unprecedented, because ECOMOG has done that elsewhere. I did that in Liberia, I did that in Sierra Leone. So I think it also did that in Gambia when Yahya Jammeh refused to leave power. However, by coming up with this joint security pact, it means these three countries, this troika of Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger, are cutting away, are peeling away from ECOWAS. Now, what is the consequence of the French departure from Niger? It is very serious, because when you look at these three countries in terms of their security capabilities, I think they are weak. Then, therefore, the French departure will leave a vacuum for the insurgency that both the three countries are fighting. Mali is fighting an insurgency, a very serious insurgency. Burkina Faso is threatened by insurgency. Niger has actually been a beacon, has been actually the strongest partner for the US and the French in the fight against insurgency in the Sahel. But now that seems to be water under the bridge. So the departure of the French will create a vacuum, which will certainly be filled by other players. So new actors, as the French exit, new actors are likely to arrive. And those actors, seeing the reaction of the Nigerians after the coup, they were waving Russian flags. They were waving Russian flags. So it is an indication that Russia is welcome in Niger. So as France departs, which is reluctant to do, and I think up to now, I think they are planning to shut down their embassy and pull out their troops, but they haven't actually done that. I think they'll do that in due course. That will quickly create a vacuum which will be filled by Russia, and I think also by Turkey. So the dynamics will change.
Douglas,
now, we also know that. Yes.
If I may interrupt, there was a question as well about this. Professor Manshipuri was asking this about Niger as a significant uranium exporter. Could you and our other panelists give a sense? He asks, I wonder how would that play into regional and global politics of counterterrorism? So since you mentioned this vacuum pulling from France, do you mind giving us a few thoughts, and the other panelists, because the question was originally asked to Anne as well. So we'd love to hear from her. Go ahead, Douglas. How does it play into counterterrorism?
Yeah, okay. Yeah, so we know that Niger is a leading producer of uranium, and this uranium is exploited by France, and this uranium is what France uses to power its energy sector. So France lights up the entire country using uranium from Niger. Niger has no power of its own. Niger depends on Nigeria for its power. And you remember some weeks, I think within the week that the coup took place, and ECOWAS was really angry, was really upset with the events in Niger, Nigeria cut power to Niger, and Niger was in darkness. So then, therefore, I think the people are saying, now that we have got uranium, which you are taking away for free, and you use that to develop the energy sector in France, and you leave us here, Nigerians, in darkness, very backward in terms of energy proficiency or energy sufficiency. So then why don't you let us keep our uranium for ourselves? However, I also learned this week that France does not entirely depend on uranium from Niger, that France has other sources of uranium. But I think the key thing, the relationship between France and Niger has been dependent on exploiting Niger's uranium, which Niger now says, we are ready to give you our uranium at market price. You are not going to take our uranium away the way you have been taking, as if it is for free, to power France and leave us in darkness. So that is the injustice that has driven Nigerians to the streets and to back the coup plotters. I hope you understand that in the middle of this conflict is also a question of resources. And that resource is uranium, which Nigerians say France is taking away for almost nothing, while uranium is a mineral which is in demand and which can actually power Niger and also uplift Niger's economy and uplift livelihoods. So this relationship between France and its former colonies is built on, it's not a win-win kind of relationship. So it's a relationship that has benefited France more than its former colonies. And I think that's the source of the grievance we see in Mali, we see in Burkina Faso, we see in Niger, and probably in other French colonies, because it is not just the resources, but also the way France created a common currency zone called the CFA, which the former French colonies in West Africa have been fighting for years. And I think now they have come up with their own currency called the ECO to replace the CFA. So in essence, France went away. How can I put it? Left African colonies, gave independence, but France actually did not live economically. So France has continued to depend on African countries, which I hear keep all their reserves in the French central bank. So this is a source of a big grievance in former French colonies, and then therefore the cause of this widespread anti-French sentiment, which is a wave that France seems to be struggling to push back. Yes.
Thank you. That's very, very helpful. Anne and Ruud, you have something to add? Did you want to jump in?
That's I completely agree with my colleague Douglas. Is that France has been taking advantage of the natural resources in their former West African colonies. But there's something else that happened, that in the meantime, the extremist movements came up and the French governments and the foreign governments have not been able to really help the local populations against those extremist movements, the jihadists. And that also added to anti-foreign sentiments, which are also allowed to have mercenaries coming in for Russia to give protection that the government was not able to.
And I wanted to say that, Anne, I know we wanted you to follow up on that. And thank you, Ruud, also for building on what Douglas was saying, because yes, that is such a huge part of the story and what people in the West are trying to understand, where this sudden sympathy towards Russia is coming from. And I think you've also kind of done some of this work with BBC, kind of looking at this, not in just the context of what's been happening post-colonial sentiment in the last few months, but over the course of decades. This isn't the first time we've seen these kinds of geopolitics playing out in Africa. And I know you said that you'd done some stories about this in other parts of the world. So I was hoping that maybe you could kind of add to what Ruud and Douglas were saying about that with maybe a little bit of historical perspective. And you don't have to be limited just to France. I mean, that's kind of the big hot button topic now, but we know this happens with all of the former colonies.
Yeah. Thank you, Julienne, and thank you to my two colleagues, because whenever we talk about Africa, we are constantly reminded that Africa is not one country. And that's because, the issues, including that colonial history, and then you look at, what is happening on the ground. Ruud did add the fact that there are these militant groups. There's Al-Qaeda, there's ISIS in the Sahel region. And, they first came in and took advantage of pre-existing conflicts within communities. So there are communities that were either pastoralists and others were farmers, and they had, long-running disagreements. And these militants came and took advantage of that, and then they spread, and then you had the former colonies like France sending in troops to come and support the countries to fight against the militants. But more than 10 years down the line, the people are frustrated because the militants have continued to expand territory in spite of that support from outside. And so they start asking these questions. But then there's also the question of people now asking about the relationship with former colonial masters, especially in Francophone Africa. there's the question of Francafrique, and President Macron has talked about it this year, and he said the age of Francafrique is over. The age of France taking advantage of Africa is over, but that's the sentiment that is on the ground, and you're seeing people waving the Russian flag in protests in Burkina Faso, in Mali, in mosques. That is, some of the speakers in mosques are talking about that. So it's quite complicated to take apart. You can't specifically pinpoint a reason why things are happening, because it's a confluence of many things. Where do we go from here? So ECOWAS is saying that it's readying a force to go in to Niger to try and take it back and hand it over to the ousted President Bazoum. And then we have seen the coalition of countries, the coup countries, Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger signing an accord to say that we will defend each other against the rest of ECOWAS if they attempt to invade us. And that is very worrying, because often when countries go to war, they say, oh, it will take 2 weeks max and this will be over. I mean, we saw it with the Russian conflict. We saw it in Ethiopia, where they said, in a very short time, we'll have sorted out this issue. But then it becomes protracted. And who suffers? It's the same people. And that is why this is really worrying. It's a very worrying development there. And the other development that we are really watching keenly is, France finally saying, because they had refused to recognize the junta in Niger, and they continue to recognize the ousted President Bazoum, and they refused to withdraw their ambassador after the junta expelled him. But now, finally, this past weekend, they have said, yes, we will take our ambassador out and we will withdraw the troops. What impact is it going to have on the ground there? And Douglas did touch on, what the uranium in the Nigerian uranium means for France. It does not account for a huge amount of their energy, source of energy. So they have other sources. It's not going to drive France into a blackout, and especially going into the colder months. So yeah, it is really interesting to watch all these things that are happening in West Africa. We have, in some cases, not very senior military people taking over, and they're accusing the governments of failing to deal with the expanding militancy, which itself is another complicated story. What is the end game for them? The analysis that we have been able to piece together is, it's also about illicit trade. They want to create a corridor from the Gulf of Guinea going all the way north across the Sahara, so that they're able to use that route for illicit trade. And so you're beginning to see more and more attacks in Northern Ivory Coast. Ghana is really concerned also about that, and this is a country that has gold, and they're worried about their mines. So it's that complicated, and I guess that is why we keep trying to break down all these issues.
That's excellent. Thank you so much, Anne. And I'm hoping that Ruud can follow on this. I know there have been several questions in the chat box about the Wagner Group and kind of where is it going now that the leader has been killed. And, what roles, and I know that I believe Ruud has been out in the field more recently in some of these areas, as a videographer, as a multimedia producer. So maybe he can tell us a little bit about the role of some of these various superpowers, Russia, China, the United States. We've talked about France. And how do you see this multipolar world affecting politics on the continent?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question, of which the answer will be very complicated, but I see it as connected to the previous topics we discussed, that Africa has a huge amount of natural resources, what you can see, it's not only the Wagner group coming in, but it's also, like Douglas said, Turkey trying to come in. It's the United States trying to come in. China was already there with their mineral extraction and giving huge loans. So looking forward, we indeed see that Prigozhin has been taken out, but it doesn't want to say that Wagner Group is not active. They seem to have two leaders now, one which is a young man and the other one is the strategist. And what I understand, they're interested in continuing their operations in Africa, and it's indeed concentrated on those minerals. I don't know whether it's not confirmed they're in Niger, but some people are afraid for that. But they're definitely there in Sudan, where they're helping extraction of gold and also other minerals. And it's a very frightening scenario that maybe the Wagner Group steps in Niger to take control of uranium mines. That's not something you want. So I see a lot of fear. And as Anne said, it leads to protracted conflicts because those generals in Niger, Mali, and Burkina Faso don't seem really interested in improving their countries. They're just looking at their own interests. And then if you connect that to the Wagner Group, yeah, it becomes a very frightening scenario, especially if you have illegal trade routes. And what I hear from the people I'm speaking to wherever I can is that the fear is very big for those scenarios because the common people will not be the beneficiaries of that.
Excellent. Does anybody else have anything to add? I know one of the things that I wanted, before we move into kind of some questions leading from there to this question of you as students wanting to go into global development, diplomacy, journalism fields, it's, as you can see, very dicey, and it's hard to find those jobs. And when you find them, it's a lot of, there's a lot of dilemmas that you're going to face. But before we go into that question, I just wanted to see if anybody wanted to add anything. I know you just mentioned Sudan. That's also a country with dealing with a lot of conflict at the moment. Ethiopia is just now coming out of a war, and that process has been very delicate. Would any of you like to just touch on those two countries?
Sudan.
And I know Douglas had a couple more countries he wanted to discuss as well. Douglas, did you want to do that? I don't know if we got. I think Douglas might be frozen. Is there? Let's see. I know he wanted to say a few things about Gabon as well as Sudan. Douglas, did you want to say a few words about Sudan, or did we freeze? Well, is there anyone else of our participants who'd like to talk about Sudan? And would you like to?
I can do that.
Sure.
Yeah, or Ruud, that's
okay. Go ahead, Ruud.
Yeah, and also I find Sudan a very sad case because I went in 2003. I went to Darfur to report on the refugee crisis, which was followed after by a genocide which cost the life of 300,000 people. And now we're in fact back in the same position 20 years later, which is completely hopeless. Yeah, and that's the same thing. It also comes with sentiments against their own government, because Sudan is a unique example. It's not even a civil war. It's a war between two armies in one country. And in fact, if you look at history, we didn't have that before. But you have two armies in one country competing for power. And I find it rather hopeless. So, and that's also a task for us journalists to keep reporting on that, because it becomes very complicated when there's no hope. Because you always have to rely on some kind of hope. If you cannot report hope, then people will lose interest, and that makes it very difficult. Yeah, that's what I wanted to say about Sudan.
And go ahead. And there are questions. There is a couple of questions about the democratic and anti-democratic trends. Are we back to the coup Beltway, is there a frustration with democratization? Should we expect more coups? Because over the last, since 2020, there have been 10 attempted coups in the continent. So there are a couple of questions in there from our audience. Given the recent military takeovers and the anti-democratic trends, could there be another coup in Niger? Is there a realistic option for ECOWAS's military intervention? Any thoughts on the overall democratization process or lack thereof?
Well, I don't think we have seen the end of coups, I'm afraid. I would love to be more optimistic, but the landscape doesn't look very promising at the moment. And what we have seen in some of those countries that had coups, I mean, you have 2 successive coups within less than 2 years in the same country, that speaks to a lot of instability politically and also within the security system. And what Ruud was just talking about, the Sudan example, it's actually a really sad one. This is a country I've been to quite a number of times, and there was a lot of hope. I remember when Omar al-Bashir, the long-serving president, was toppled. That was 2019, I believe, and people were hoping that this was a new dawn, that civilians were going to finally take charge. And just before they did, just before they were supposed to, on paper, there was a coup and the generals took over, and it's just been on a downward spiral since then. Things were already so difficult, and I don't know whether we report enough on that. You go to a country that is oil producing, that has refineries, but people stay in queues for days, sometimes even weeks, waiting to fuel their cars. And, for us, our fixers sometimes are forced to use the black market to get fuel so that we can move around to tell these stories. The health infrastructure was just on its knees. Our fixer was actually a medical doctor by training. He had been practicing, and he said it just got so frustrating because he has the knowledge, but he just can't do anything. There are no drugs, there are no machines in the hospitals, and he can see people coming into the hospital day and night, and he knows what needs to be done, but he just can't do it, because all he has is knowledge. He doesn't have the tools that he needs to do the job, and he thought it was too frustrating for him. So he became a fixer for journalists. And, there were so many stories. And by that time, and this was arguably peacetime, anyone who could have left Sudan had left. Anyone who had contacts outside to leave had left. This was one of Africa's former giants economically. It just nosedived. And it's really looking at the history, and it is long, and they have had protracted wars that led to the split of the country with South Sudan, and just trying to piece together everything. But what Ruud is talking about, the hopelessness, everyone feels that, because they have a unique situation where they had a militia that was created by the government to do its bidding, to do, the dirty work, so to speak, in Darfur, which later was mainstreamed, but was not absorbed into the mainstream army. So they end up with 2 armies and with 2 generals who want to be in charge. And those are the people fighting. And it's nothing about Sudanese. It's about who gets the power. And that is why it is such a, to use Ruud's description, it's really a hopeless situation. It's a zero-sum game. So in terms of Gabon, it was an interesting one. And that's why we need to look at these coups on a case-by-case basis. You can't really group them together as one and just analyze them like it's one occurrence. So the Gabon case was different because a coup takes place, which everyone, including international, even though people did not really want to speak out, kind of celebrates, because it's the end of a dynasty. the Bongo dynasty. They had been in power for decades. And there were questions about this democratic process that had taken place, the election that had taken place. And then we were looking into the person, the junta that has taken over. Are they related? There were rumors about the personal relationships to the Bongos. Do they come from the same family or the same clan? So yeah, it's all that. But this is one coup where, yeah, it was being condemned, but people are thinking, well, it's also actually the end of a dynasty.
Absolutely. Thank you for explaining the differences between these countries. Doug is able to jump back in our Zoom. Doug, did you want to say a couple of words about these anti-democratic trends, as well as the immigration displacement aspect that both Ruud and Anne have described?
Thank you. I'm sorry, guys. I'm not in a very stable internet place. So let me start with Gabon. I think there are two problems in Africa's democracy. One is an attempt by sitting presidents, by some sitting presidents, to perpetuate themselves in office, in a way that actually makes them life presidents. We see that in Cameroon, where Paul Biya has been in power since 1982. We see that in Uganda, where Yoweri Museveni came to power in 1986 and promised that he was not going to be like the others, meaning he was somebody who came just to do what he had to do in Uganda and exit. He has not exited. We saw that in Angola. We see that in Togo, Nasigbe. We see that in Equatorial Guinea. And that is what went on in Gabon, where the Bongos came to power in 1967. And the Bongos, with the assistance of France, perpetuated themselves by further taking power in 1967 and passing power to San, I think, in 2007. So we in Gabon, we were talking about a dynasty, in the 21st century in an African country, where the African Union has spelled out, where the African Union in a charter is very clear about elections and their cycles and the cycles of those elections in Africa. The African Union has a charter that describes African elections and their cycles. So we now have countries which have written the election cycle in the constitution, either 2 terms of 5 years each, or 1 term of 7 years, as we are seeing in Senegal. However, as we speak now, as we discuss this issue, there are many African leaders. There are some African leaders who are busy trying to change the constitutions, their constitutions, to stay in power. So they are happening in the countries I have given as examples. The other thing, what happened is different. What happened in Sudan is an Omar al-Bashir legacy. That was Bashir's legacy. Bashir created Janjaweed, which then evolved to become the rapid support forces that are now fighting with government forces for control of Sudan. Now, the reason al-Bashir created the Janjaweed was to crush dissent in Darfur. The Janjaweed committed atrocities in Darfur, for which Bashir stands indicted. But
all right. Oh, I think we lost him again. Oh, thank you, Doug. We really appreciate those details. We were just looking at a question asked by one of our San Francisco State students. Jesse, did you want to ask that question so our panelists can take a stab at it?
Sure. Thank you, Burcu. This question comes from your Barbo Cabrera regarding climate change and transition towards renewable energy. And the question is there a politicization that we see of that issue on the continent, much as there is in America? And what are the effects of that politicization if it exists?
I'm happy to take that. Thank you so much for that question. It's an important question because, climate change is something that affects people's lives. And yes, we do also follow what happens, the conversations that are happening in the US. In terms of politicization, I wouldn't say that it is as much here on the continent as what we have seen in the US, because I think the debate has been quite vibrant in the US, and you have quite a significant number of people who actually don't even believe in climate change or in global warming. However, on the continent, I think people are more, they're feeling the impact more. I'll give you an example. In the Horn of Africa, that is the countries that on that part that looks like the horn of a rhinoceros in Eastern Africa, we have come from 5 consecutive seasons of failed rains. And why that is important is that these are communities that depend on rain. It has to rain for them to be able to grow food so that they can eat. They need that rain so that their animals, their livestock, can get water. And therefore, they have lost millions of livestock. I think it is estimated at 9 million heads of cattle lost over the last couple of years because of that recurrent drought. They have also lost family, their children, their people who have died as a result. And we even saw wildlife dying, which is very unusual because of drought. And so when you talk to them that, these are signs of climate change, it hits home immediately. So you don't really have a big debate about whether climate change exists. It is affecting people right in their homes, right? It is affecting livelihoods. And so they really see that impact firsthand. So we don't really have a big debate about whether climate change is real or what. And the governments, are also trying to respond to that, but at the same time also trying to balance with economic growth. So you have the example of Uganda, which recently discovered oil. And when the world is trying to move away from fossil fuel, they want to exploit it because they say, finally, we found this resource that transformed the economies of other countries and made them rich. We also want to exploit it so that at least we can get somewhere, we can grow our economy. And, you have European countries that are saying, no, this is going against what we have agreed in terms of climate targets. They have even passed some resolutions in their parliament trying to dissuade. Well, dissuade is a softer term, Uganda from exploiting oil, from building the infrastructure to exploit it. But Uganda is saying, no, wait a minute. Some of you are even going back to coal because of the war in Ukraine. You have restarted your coal projects because you need energy. We also need energy. We need to exploit this fossil fuel. We will transition. In the end, after all, a lot of our energy is from renewable sources already, much more than the countries that are saying, no, don't go the oil way. So yes, there is the politics that is there. Even in Kenya, as I talked about, an example of a country that is almost nearly there in terms of transitioning to green energy, 93% of its energy coming from renewable sources. The government has also been talking about exploiting coal because they need it for industry, for industrialization. And they were even taken to court by activist groups. And I think the activist groups won in court. They call themselves Decolonize. And so you have a country that, yes, it's doing so well in terms of going green, but at the same time, it's saying, no, wait a minute. There's something that worked elsewhere, which we also want to try so that we can grow our economy. So yes, the politics is there, but people, I think, get it. Whether it's because of floods, we're having more tropical cyclones, especially along the eastern African coast, Mozambique. I was there in 2019 when we had Cyclone Idai hitting Mozambique, and it was really devastating. So those are not people you're going to argue with about climate change.
Absolutely. And we have a wonderful question that segues into our conversations very nicely. Nelly, one of our SFSU students, was asking, this hopelessness, anxiety, the sense of politics that is playing around, that people are not fooled. They see the politics playing out. How does that affect your work when you're reporting from these organizations, from these situations? And how does it work as a journalist or an individual, a professional in global development? Ruud, do you mind giving us a few of your thoughts? Because we know that you've done multimedia journalism from these regions.
Yeah, thank you for that important question. Now, first of all, I think you need to be very strong emotionally to be able to deal with all that negative information. But on the other hand, I've been doing this in Africa since 2002. And when I came, things were quite hopeless also. So I started reporting on that. But the good thing, what I noticed about the African continent, although people might feel hopeless, nobody gives up. People stand up the next day and continue fighting the problems. And that's really wonderful to see, because I've been in Europe for a while, and there we have something that you can be overworked. They call it burnouts. Well, I've never seen an African here with a burnout. They just take their problems and continue with it. And that's the energy I pull from it. And what's very interesting is that the technology has changed. When I came here, we had those big Betacam cameras that were very heavy, and they last 30 minutes. They have to change the battery. And now we have a wide range of tools that we can use to go live everywhere. You just walk with your mobile phone wherever you go. In fact, across Africa, internet penetration is quite high. You can go live wherever you want. You can be in the middle of a refugee camp in Chad and do a live story there. So it might look hopeless, but also the ways to report on it improved. And also the people on the other side, that they realize that. So it can be, I've been trying to get into Sudan like many other journalists did, but the visa are not issued. So what you do, you try to call somebody who has a smartphone there and have the person walk around on the street and show how it looks like. That those things we couldn't do. So that the hope you're getting from the hopelessness, that you're able to tell other people about the problem. And I believe that exposure of anything lead to good things. So at the end of the day, we might see that things are getting better, and then we go on to the next problem. So we always have some work to do.
I wanted to, before we go on to the rest of the questions, thank you so much, Ruud. And I wanted to have Anne and Douglas piggyback on that in terms of their own experience reporting, and also just the outlook. You know, you're talking to a lot of students that are they have family from Africa, but they're based in the United States. So if they go into the field to work in global development, diplomacy, journalism, they're coming in as outsiders. So I wanted your perspective on how you see those industries giving more opportunities to Africans from the continent of Africa, and kind of some of that democratization around the media business, but also, you know, where you see foreign workers being instrumental and important to continuing the work that Ruud is also talking about. Because what I love this idea that what he's saying is that in the Sudan and these places, you are creating a more democratic version of journalism where you're getting the people to be those citizen journalists for you. So I'm wondering if we can get it from your perspective, from coming from the region as well.
Thank you, Julienne. And it's very true what Ruud says. Yes, it's you know, you keep doing this, and you know, this is a continent that has so many conflicts going on, and they tend to go on for a long time. And once you're done with one, you go on to the other, and you can get exhausted even as a journalist. And you know, you just ask yourself, is my work making any impact? Is there a reason to still go back to this conflict? Who is listening? Who cares about this? But whenever we speak to people, the people who are affected, that is what drives me. Because in the case of Sudan, for instance, generals are fighting and the people are suffering. And it's about who gets power. It's not about the Sudanese woman who's, a mother of 9 down in the village. And that's the story I want to get out. I have to do this. I have to try and get the generals to put these questions to them so that, I need to speak through truth to power, because this woman, this mother of 9, does not have that access. So that's what drives me. That's what keeps me going. Otherwise, it would really just be, you're not happy to go back to work because it's really depressing. So we do it for the people. It's an important part of our job. The question you raise is very interesting, because part of the reason I do what I do, part of the reason I have the job I have at the BBC is part of that democratization, if I can borrow the word that you're using. Because they got to a point where my employer, at least I know, got to a point where there was the recognition that you needed voices from within as well, telling stories from where they live. It brings a whole different perspective. And it's really about diversity. So, and for me, from where I sit, it's not replacing what we have had before, because then that is not diversity. We need the perspective from the outside looking in, because then they recognize things which have been normalized. If you were born when your country was in conflict and it has continued to be in conflict, whether it's the same conflict or a different one, there are things that you think are normal. There are abuses, human rights abuses that you think are normal. But somebody coming from outside will be like, wait a minute, no, that is not normal. That should not be happening. And we need to talk about it. At the same time, they may miss that local knowledge. Coming from outside, you may not have that local knowledge, and that is what I bring into this story. And therefore, at the end of the day, we have this multiplicity of ideas, and I think it really works, and it really serves our audiences well, and I hope it continues. And that is really my message to the students watching today, that you come from a very important your contribution is very important, because if you have family here, if you grew up here, or people who live in Africa, that is very important local knowledge that you already have. And then from your experiences and from living in a Western country, you tend to look at things from a different perspective. And that is really, really important. So you have the two things that we are trying to put together here. So there's a lot of room for you on the continent, whether you go into international development, whether it is international relations, the more political side of things, whether it's journalism, all this is needed. And the world today is so interconnected that if you lack something, people will immediately point it out. So yes, your contribution, I think, is going to be unique and much needed for the audiences that we serve and for the communities that we work for. I'll just leave you with one example. The outbreak of Ebola in Eastern Democratic Republic of Congo, which is the second largest in history, but the first in the DRC, and was really deadly. So when the outbreak was declared, this is a region that had never seen Ebola, and it's a conflict area. We counted more than 70 conflicts that were going on at that time, small conflicts within a relatively small geographical area. And so you had all these international organizations just coming in and coming to tell people, we have come to help you. You have Ebola, and so we have to treat you. And people are like, what is Ebola? You are Ebola. And they were running to the forest. I mean, I spoke to people who are like, when I heard they said that we have Ebola, and yet they are the ones who are coming. We didn't have Ebola before they started coming. Well, that's what they thought. And people were running away. from these health facilities that were set up quickly in tents and wherever to try and help the community deal with Ebola. And then they realized, okay, we didn't do it right. So they stepped back and sent anthropologists ahead of them, most of them local anthropologists, to go and talk to people about what is Ebola, why is it important for you to seek medical treatment as soon as you get Ebola, what should you do if you suspect somebody has Ebola, to go and, the epidemiologists went to the ground to talk to people in their own language. And later now, people started warming up to that idea and then going to hospitals. So you see why local knowledge is very important. You can have the best intentions to bring change, because, I mean, you're leaving school, you're leaving university, and you want to create change in your community. You want to bring change to the world, and you go there with the best intentions. But what the reaction is, people run away from you. So that is why it's very important to have that connection. You can't have one and not the other, and that's why we need to work together.
Thank you. That is a wonderful point. I hope none of Jesse's or my students will be the people that locals run away from. All right. I think, Julienne, you wanted to raise, we have a lot of questions from the students, so you and Jesse will ask them. I think, Julienne, you had one in mind for Douglas, I think.
Yeah, I just wanted to kind of make a segue between what Anne was saying and where we'd like Douglas to go is, by the way, Anne has also a background in public health. So apart from her journalism studies, she has, I forgot what your other degree was in, public health, right? So just the importance of, if you have other interests besides journalism and international relations, it's not, having this kind of big social science and communications background, but if you can get specializations, that's extremely important, as per the case of Anne doing the kind of work that she's talking about. Douglas, there was a question in here about, we've talked about the role of Russia, the role of France, and now there was a question here from somebody who shares my last name, Gage, about has China's growing Belt and Road Initiative impacted local regions within Africa, and what implications could that have according to your experience and expertise? I think it's a great question to ask you. You're working for China Television. That must be a very interesting dynamic trying to address the question of China. And so I'm hoping that you can weigh in on that one. Whoops, did he freeze?
Yeah, thank you very much, colleagues, students. The Belt and Road is an initiative that is now about 10 years old, having been launched in 2013 by President Xi. Now, one of Africa's biggest problems is infrastructure. Whether it's airports, whether it's ports. So the Belt and Road Initiative has tried to it is actually what we can say that China identifies itself. How China identifies, how Africa identifies with China is really in the infrastructure, in the area of infrastructure. So if you look at some of the biggest infrastructure projects, for example, we have the standard gauge railway. So we have the standard gauge railway in Kenya. We have a rail system also in Addis, Ethiopia. We have another rail network in Nigeria, another network in Angola. Several networks that are tied to the belt, and I think close to about 30 African countries have signed on to that Belt and Road Initiative. So it's a sort of cooperation between African countries and China to develop their infrastructure. Bits, railway, ports, and of course also build airport. This way, I think some of the court have opened up, to keep capital this
I think we're cutting
point A to
off. I think we're
has really been yes.
I think we're
Yeah.
cutting off a lot, Doug. We really appreciate it. Let's see. Let's go to Jesse. You had a couple of questions you wanted to address, and then I'll come back to Ruud for Alyssa's question. Go ahead, Jesse.
Sure. No, we have some questions coming in. One of the questions I'll addresses the technological development in Africa. This has been mentioned already, but has this development made an impact in regards to the economy and climate change, and what other kind of effects of this technological wave are we seeing on the continent?
I'm happy to take that. So it cuts both ways. So in Kenya, for instance, we have seen the development of mobile money transfer just completely change the economy. With just my mobile phone, I can send money to my mother in the village. I can go to the supermarket and shop. I can do whatever I want. So I can't remember the last time I carried cash money. So whatever transaction it is, from less than $1 to $1,000, I can transact over the phone through my mobile without even the internet. So that has completely changed the economy, and it just made business so easy. It has had a huge impact on entrepreneurs. But at the same time, when you look at the impact of technology on climate change, this is the African continent is the region with the least number of and the least advanced climate predicting or weather predicting stations, weather stations. Just a fraction of what one European country has, for example. It's that bad. And it is one of the things that came up during the recent Africa Climate Conference, that if you cannot predict how tomorrow will be, you cannot prepare for it. And that's why people are so vulnerable here. So there's still a long way to go. But at the same time, the kind of vibrancy that Ruud was talking about, young people developing apps, and I have seen very creative apps that people have developed. That is making a huge difference and an instant impact on the economy. So that's why I say it cuts both ways.
I'd really like to weigh in there because I really like what Anne is talking about, but I also have an issue when it comes to technology. Technology that transforms, technology that revolutionizes, because Africa is still pretty much an exporter of raw materials. Africa is wired, if you look at the global value chain, Africa is really at the bottom of that ladder. And the big debate has always been technology transfer. If, for example, somebody comes to build the railway or to build the road, or the person who manufactures vehicles, there is a big issue there. So that when it comes to technology that can actually transform, Africa still struggles. And Africa, I don't know whether this is deliberate, whether this is how the world is wired to work. Africa is always at the bottom of the global value chain. So if you look at Africa's cocoa, if you look at Africa's coffee, the finest chocolate is made in Switzerland. Why is the finest chocolate not made in Ghana or Cote d'Ivoire, where the cocoa comes from? The finest tea, the finest coffee. South Africa cannot put a final finish on its diamonds. And the issue is technology. So where is that transformative technology? Why is Africa always crying technology transfer? Technology transfer, in my view as a journalist who has covered these issues for a long time, is a political issue. Nobody wants to give you their technology because nobody wants you to prosper. So then the acquisition of the necessary technology that Africa requires to experience really transformative economic development isn't in Africa. Then therefore, Africa still remains relegated to a continent to a very large extent that exports for goods to be finished elsewhere and then re-imported to Africa. What I would expect, for example, why should Africa be importing cars? Why can't cars be manufactured in Africa? Why can't, for example, Mercedes-Benz set up in Nairobi to manufacture, to employ Kenyans, to learn the technology, to transfer that technology here? Why do we have to buy finished Mercedes-Benz from Germany? Some countries insist, if you want our people to buy your car, make it here. So that way, our people get involved in the process of making that car. Then after 10 years, after 20 years, we have the technology and we have the expertise to make those cars. I think Africa, many people are still happy with Africa being a net importer of almost everything. Then therefore, this talk about technology that transform is really, for me, a pipe dream. And that is why we find, even in the agricultural sector, there's no value addition. Where is the value addition in the agricultural sector? Because value addition creates jobs. Value addition involves processes. Value addition involves production of a range of products from one key primary product. It creates jobs. It employs people, you know? So that technology isn't here. And that has been a debate that has gone on for a very long time. And from where I think, and in my view, that technology isn't here. And Africa will have to find ways of acquiring that technology.
Absolutely. Thank you for that wonderful point about the need for technology transfers and so on. We have about 5 minutes, so we want to move the question. One of our students, Ellis, wanted to know, what is your favorite part of your job? And Ruud, I know that you wanted to talk a little bit about being not from Africa and reporting on Africa. Would you give us your thoughts? And we'd love to hear everybody's favorite parts of their jobs, because this is what young people are going to go into. Go ahead.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, my most favorite part of my job is just the interaction with the people I'm reporting on. Just to sit in a refugee camp, for example, and have a discussion about life with a cup of milk tea, maybe from a camel, and just sitting there and then sharing that I will tell my story as well. Because if I tell my story, I get more in return from the person I'm talking to. And what I want to say to the students, there's place for everybody in Africa. There are 54 countries with millions of stories, so everybody's welcome. Every day there's something to tell. And there's another point. When I came here in Africa, I was kind of innocent about Africa. I didn't even know where all the countries were. That took a while to learn. Now, happily, I know them. But you can also take your knowledge home about what is really important to you, because the West is kind of materialistic. That's what I see. We all want the latest gadgets and stuff like that. But when you sit down with a woman in a refugee camp and you just talk with her about her children, how they survive, you bring that knowledge home. And I think that brings an interaction between the East and the West, that it's not only about richness or having the latest mobile phones, but just having a normal life. And even in those refugee camps, you can see a normal life. People take care of their children, even they have nothing. And if you take that knowledge home, I think, yeah, we start to communicate between the West and the South and the North and the East. And that creates a very responsive world.
Thank you. Anne, did you want to say a few words?
Yes. Well, for me, it's being able to touch the lives of people. That's the best part of my job. And, you know, sometimes you do a story, it's so difficult to get there. It takes you days. You're dealing with governments that don't want you there, trying to get the visas, and then you go on the ground. The transport isn't great. I have been to places where there were no rooms to sleep in. So chances are we were going to sleep in the car. That was in at the border near Tigray, because we couldn't get into Tigray in northern Ethiopia. So we went into Sudan and drove across from Khartoum, the capital, to the east of the country, to the border area there. That was the closest we could get to Tigray. We could see it from, you know, across the river. And there were no rooms, there are no hotels, and there's no luxury. Luckily, the UN helped us and let us sleep in their office. And so they were working on the office, but I'm sleeping on the floor, and the cameraman is sleeping a few meters away. But when you come back and the story that you have done with so much difficulty, something is done about that. You know, the UN Security Council meets and passes an important resolution. Governments give money to the people who are affected by some of these things. And sometimes it is more direct than that. Sometimes because we go talk to people about their personal lives, about their stories, and that person that you met in that refugee camp, as Ruud says, and told their story, you know, gets help. I sleep really well, knowing that I have touched one life, and, you know, it keeps me going. It really keeps me going, doing my job. It's not easy, but such stories, I feel so fulfilled, and it's the best part of my job.
Thank you. And Douglas, do you want to tell us your favorite part as a sort of to wrap up our discussion?
Yeah, thank you very much. I like to do stories that, and I have done stories that influence policy. I like to do stories, and I have done stories that effect change, that make policy makers scratch their heads, that make governments think. I like to do stories that everybody wants to hide under the table. I like to do stories that the story that is hidden inside a story, the story behind a story. So my almost 30 years in journalism, I've experienced fulfillment when my stories achieve those goals. And I can look back really way back, even before I joined China Global Television, when I was an investigative reporter. The sort of stories I did, particularly at a time when the issues such as issues of child abuse, child prostitution, were many Africans were still in denial about such issues, that they didn't exist. I remember one time when I did a story about tourism at the Kenyan coast, and how some tourists come to the country to prey on young children, on young girls. The first time that story was reported, the first time that story was published and aired, there was denial from the government. And what we did was we carried more evidence of the fact that that was happening. And as time went by and by, the government acknowledged that that was a problem, and that indeed it needed to look into it. And then the journey of policies that have now been put in place that protect the rights of children and women are in many ways, I link them to some of the stories I did in those very early years. I've also done stories about crime and why it's so easy, you know, the porous borders and the easy movement of small arms into places like Nairobi, you know, and how these arms are very easy to change hands and so on and so forth. So I like to do stories, like I said, that effect change, that influence change, that make policy thinkers scratch their heads, that in the end lead to policy formulation and policy implementation. That's my joy.
This is wonderful. Julienne, any last words? We really do need to wrap up because we would really like to thank Julienne Gage for putting this wonderful panel together. Without her help, this panel wouldn't exist. And I'm very grateful to Jesse for helping us as chair of journalism department. We are very grateful to international relations and journalism students that have filled out this a question and answer period with wonderful questions. Julienne, any last notes to end on for our students?
Sure, just wanted to echo what everybody else has said. I think, you know, the personal relationships that you build in the field are probably the most important thing. And, you know, sometimes walking in and feeling like you have no idea how to fit into this scenario can be the most awkward thing, or it can be the most amazing thing I found. And especially in Africa, people are so welcoming and warm and able to just take you in and help you find the way if you are open to them and vulnerable with them. And so on that, I wanted to say, I think everybody's happy to share their email addresses if you have more questions about particular topics. I know we weren't able to get to everything. And also, if you want to ask them about their careers, you can also ask me. If you want to talk also about kind of other options outside of journalism, like some of this global communications work and consulting work, institutions and NGOs and think tanks all need communications people as well. So happy to discuss some of that with folks and kind of the pros and cons of both fields, both in terms of like questions of, I guess, you know, your ethics and where you feel yourself telling the story and what you feel comfortable with, but also kind of where the jobs are in this new industry. So happy to also contribute to that. And one last thing for the journalists is if you have stories, as you were just telling us, whether those are high impact stories about right now, or human interest stories about refugees, about healthcare, about education, technology, youth that you want to share with the students, you can send those to us and we will get those to them so that they can see more samples of your work.
Absolutely. And thank you so much, Ruud, Anne, and Douglas for being here. It's very late right now for you. You need to go back to your families. We are very grateful for your time and energy and the positive ideas you have given our students. Thank you so much. Have a wonderful evening.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you very
Have
much.
a wonderful
Bye-bye.
day.
Bye-bye. This concludes our meeting. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Be well. Bye-bye.
Bye. Okay.